Tonight's presentation is focused on supporting students with ADHD and ADD in school and college. Today we have a special guest with us, Hallie Fetterman with the Cleveland Clinic Center for Behavioral Health. Hallie is with the Cleveland Clinic, as I said, and also the clinical director for the Cleveland Clinic's ADHD summer program, which is an amazing program that many of our clients have participated in and love. And I think the application was recently made available, so that's something you can check out on their website. I'm going to, at this point, hand it over to Hallie. She's going to start tonight's presentation with talking about ADHD from a clinical perspective. And then I will end the presentation with a discussion of how to support students with ADHD in school and college. So I'm going to hand it off to Hallie. Actually, I think it probably makes more sense, Hallie, for you to take control so that you can flip through your slides. So I'll go ahead and share control with you.
Okay, great. Do you want me to pull up my slides?
Yeah.
Great. Gotcha. It's my turn in the hot seat now. Sharing my screen. All right. So can you see these slides? Are we good?
Yes, we're great. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So like Janet said, I'll talk a little bit about, what ADHD is. And when I do these types of talks, there is kind of like an obligatory slide about the diagnostic criteria. And if you have gone through an evaluation for ADHD, you'll be pretty familiar with those criteria because that is a tool that we use to identify and diagnose ADHD. But as you are also probably aware, given that there's a lot of information out there, sometimes helpful, sometimes maybe not so helpful information on the internet about alternative or additional symptoms, or kind of going beyond just that very clinical diagnosis of ADHD is what I would love to do with this presentation, to give a little bit of perspective about what that can look like in real life. So opening with a quote from Dr. Ned Hallowell, who is a very prominent researcher in ADHD. If you've heard of the phrase ADHD is like having a Ferrari car with bicycle brakes, he's the one who coined that kind of term or description of ADHD. And so he says that ADHD is a term that describes the way of being in the world. It's neither entirely a disorder nor entirely an asset. An array of traits specific to a unique kind of mind. So it can be a distinct advantage or an abiding curse, depending on how a person manages it. So I really think this encapsulates a great definition of ADHD. So I have some well-meaning parents or teachers say it's a superpower, and that's not entirely fair. It can be very debilitating and, can be very challenging for a lot of people. And at the same time, there are some positive things about ADHD. So my encouragement overall message to families is to, kind of help your child or yourself, if you are diagnosed with ADHD, understand your strengths related to ADHD, but also recognize and know how to advocate for what you need, because that is a skill that will really help you get far, and in terms of managing. So in terms of ADHD statistics, a quick kind of rundown here. There's a lot of numbers out there in the research, but a good estimation is 5 to 10% of children and 2.5 to 5% of adults diagnosed with ADHD. Those numbers, I believe, are specific to the United States, but what we see out in research across countries, across racial and ethnic backgrounds, social classes, et cetera, is that we see a similar prevalence. So it's not unique to a certain type of people or people living somewhere. It is really kind of a pervasive, and people will think of it as, just a difference in your brain or brain difference. So ultimately, we don't have a great explanation as to what causes ADHD. And with many mental health challenges, there's probably not one single cause that we know of. But it is interesting. ADHD is, as you'll see the quote down here, the genetics of ADHD is almost as strong as height, which is always a fact that I think is pretty fascinating. So if you have a family member, and especially if you have a parent with ADHD, you're much more likely to inherit ADHD yourself. And then, there are external factors or environmental factors that can contribute as well. So things like premature birth, low birth weight, exposure to stress or toxins during pregnancy are also things that have been associated with instances of ADHD. So here we are on that slide of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So you'll see that there are two different categories. So one category of inattention and one category of hyperactivity or impulsivity. So each of these have 9 symptoms, and kids need to have 6 out of 9 symptoms in one or both categories, and then adults meet criteria for 5 out of 9 symptoms. So before we go through them, the other kind of necessary components of an ADHD diagnosis are that the symptoms have occurred for 6 or more months. They're occurring in more than one setting, so it is chronic. However, I will say with that caveat, in some tricky cases, I do see kids where the symptoms are more prevalent at school or at home, especially in like younger kids or some of those teens, high school kids. And that's because there's a lot of different expectations between school and home. So especially for younger kids, school is a place where there's a lot of routine and structure, and at the same time, a lot of directed attention and a lot of effortful thinking. So hopefully younger kids are not coming home and sitting and listening to you lecture at them for 6 hours a day. So there's it's very reasonable to have some difference in symptoms between environments, but we would see that at least some symptoms are occurring in more environments than just one. And more often that's school and home, but it could also be home and sports or home or some other community activity. And then functional impairment. So that's the other thing that's important here. So everyone exhibits these symptoms to some degree at some point. What makes them ADHD is the frequency that they're occurring, and then the kind of clinical or what we would call functional impact. So everyone forgets things once in a while, but is your forgetfulness causing you to miss appointments or be detrimental to your relationships with your peers or cause low grades? That's where it's really getting in the way of your ability to kind of shine and do your best. So those kind of caveats are also important in addition to looking and kind of checking off if you feel like you, or if a child feels like they exhibit some of these symptoms. So as you see with, like, we'll take inattention first, things like failing to give close attention to details. So we call this making silly mistakes, like going through a page and doing all addition instead of subtraction because they didn't read the instructions or look close enough, or to see that there's another side of the page that they had to do. So difficulty sustaining attention. So here's another thing that we'll talk about a little bit more, is that there's a thought that ADHD or kids with ADHD, they can't have it if they're able to pay attention to video games for a really long time, or like Legos, things that they love to do. So when we're talking about difficulty sustaining focus, we're talking about things that take a lot of, that aren't inherently interesting or fascinating for your child. So everyone has a little bit of difficulty. It's typical to drift off a little bit, but if you're doing it repeatedly over time and require a lot of redirections back, and it's getting in the way, then that would, definitely meet symptom criteria. So listening when spoken to directly is thinking about like daydreaming. I'll skip through some of these for sake of time, but things like difficulty organizing. So again, and we'll talk through, and I believe Janet will probably talk through also, like, the difference between knowing and then actually doing. So a lot of kids with ADHD do know how to organize, or they have some skill set. So ADHD is not a disorder of intelligence. So kids with ADHD are very, very smart, and they usually know what to do, but the actual putting it into practice at the moment, or what we would call the point of performance, is the difficult area. So I do see a lot of kids for like organizational skills or executive functioning things. And it's so funny because they can probably like organize this and they can do it great. But in the moment when they're at school, when they have the choice of opening up their folder, putting it in, putting the folder back where it's supposed to go, all that stuff, versus just shoving it in their desk, a lot of the times they're just going to do the easier one and shove it in their desk. And so then over time that builds into, really messy desk, can't find their things. You can see how this all kind of compounds on each other. And then we have hyperactivity and impulsivity. So this is more of, that stereotypical kid who has a really hard time staying seated, kind of running around. We think of, excessive talking or blurting out, interrupting. So again, these are the ones that, again, can also really impact like peer relationships, but also performance in school. Of note, what we typically see is kids trend to more of this combined type where there's symptoms of both when they're younger. But when you get into adulthood, a lot of these hyperactive or impulsive symptoms either drop off or they internalize. So we see more inattentive type symptoms. So you'll see if you are, a middle schooler or teen, it's not really cool to be that kid who's kind of bopping around or making a lot of noise. They want to be like their other kids or like the other kids around them. So a lot of those kids struggle with inattention, which is, certainly a more challenging component of the diagnosis to identify sometimes and work with teachers about providing supports. So this next slide is talking a bit about what I just mentioned. So I really like this graphic that I have where kind of like crossing out deficit, underlining sometimes hyperactivity. So there's a lot of people who say the name is just awful. So it's a misnomer and it causes a lot of stigma or misunderstanding because kids with ADHD don't have difficulty, necessarily, they can pay attention. They just usually pay attention to things that are more interesting than the thing that they should be doing. So it's like their brains are currently always scanning for something more interesting, always scanning, whereas other people who may not have ADHD are able to kind of stick with it and say, I got to get this done, and then I can go do that thing. They have a lot easier of a time being able to direct their attention to those things. So it's interesting, you can see here in 1968, a psychologist called it the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. And there's a lot of cool data out there that it was, ADHD has been around forever. It's been called a lot of different things, and it probably will be called something different in the future. And so as of now, so our current revision of our diagnostic manual came out in 2013, so potentially a new one coming out soon. But we call it ADHD, and then you can either be diagnosed ADHD inattentive type, ADHD hyperactive impulsive type, or ADHD combined type. So ADHD inattentive type is what we would previously call ADD, but a lot of people have been diagnosed with ADD and still, maintain that diagnosis. But it's just worthwhile to note that we're all talking about the same thing. It just sounds a little different sometimes. So this is another I think, cool piece of information or way to think about your kids with ADHD, their brains, without getting too much into like all of the fancy names for their brain and all the chemicals in there. And it's very helpful to think about people have two types of attention. So we have a default mode network and a task mode network. So our default mode network is our automatic strong attention. So this is where when you're in a like creative like bout, you're fascinated with something, it's really not effortful to be playing video games, or if you're an artist, you're getting into the flow or the zen state. So this is what you really like to do and it's not that hard. Whereas directed attention is more of like going to work, getting your work done, all of those things that we see at school. And it's effortful, so it's harder to use. We have to make an effort to do it, and then it gets depleted as well. So it would be really cool if we each had our own little like battery pack that showed how much we had left for the day. And sometimes I think of that with some of the kids we work with. And you obviously know your child best, so you'll know when their battery is really low and when, kind of to shift to the other thing. So as another kind of frame of reference, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So again, it's really originating in the brain, and it is a brain-based difference. So it's helpful to know that, I think, as a caregiver or parent, because it's not something that is entirely made by the environment, although the environment can make it better or worse. And that's why we're talking about like school supports and things that can be very helpful there. So last note about these two networks, so you can think of it as your brain having a little toggle. So people who do not have ADHD are able to toggle back and forth a little bit more easily than people who have ADHD. So their toggle, and I don't know, for lack of better words, like gets stuck in that default mode. and maybe some flickers of going back to the directed or task mode, but just a lot less consistency than we might be able to see with people without ADHD. So really fascinating. There's a lot of cool brain research out there too that shows like what part of the brains light up in people with ADHD. And you can see here that both networks turn on, so your default and your task mode when using directed attention if you have ADHD. Whereas the opposite is true. If you don't have ADHD, then just your task mode is on. So you can imagine kids with ADHD are working very hard and they want to do well. But there's just like a lot going on up in there that's making it a little challenging for them. So overall, what this means is that kids with ADHD have high rates of variability in their behavior and performance. So this artist, her name is Danny Donovan, and her like tag, I guess, is down below. But she has her whole thing is she makes ADHD like pictures and memes and content. So this one is one of the ones that I like a lot, especially this first one where it talks about motivation. So not a lack of motivation, but again, when we're thinking about like dopamine in your brain, it's not that you have too much, it's not that you don't have enough, it's that it's dysregulated. So sometimes you're great and you're doing perfect, or you're doing way too much, or you're not doing enough, but it's really hard for them to find that middle ground. And so as a parent, I can tell you as, you know, as someone who works with a lot of parents of kids with ADHD, that's often the most frustrating thing is that you find something that works and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. And maybe it'll work in like 2 weeks from now, but it's always kind of like a guessing game. And you know, it's helpful as a parent to know that, I think, because the thing that's most helpful for kids is consistency, and also having those realistic expectations that you'll have days that are good, you'll have days that are bad, but overall, if you can kind of step back and recognize you're doing pretty good and you'll get through this, I think that goes a lot for the kids, but also you as a parent. Um, So this is something I also always typically mention with families when especially when I first diagnose. This is the 30% rule that has been coined by Dr. Russell Barkley, who is also another really well-known researcher within the field of ADHD. And so he talks about how kids with ADHD have a 30% on average delay in their brain development, especially in this prefrontal cortex part of your brain, than their same aged peers. So that prefrontal cortex of your brain is the last part to develop for anyone. So your brain develops from the back to the front. And it's not fully developed until 25 to 28 years old. And I've even read research that suggests, 32 years old. So what this means is that, for example, a 6-year-old might be having temper tantrums that look like a 4-year-old, or a 16-year-old who's just about to drive, kind of scary for mom because executive functioning age may not be, quite appropriate yet. And I say that because of my own experience with my family members, really being upset they had to wait, but ultimately, my family went together and kind of thought about all these factors. So it's really important to think about, what your child's able to do versus what their chronological age is. And again, helpful to adjust your expectations, not that you should lower your expectations for your child by any means just because they have ADHD. But again, just make sure that they are getting the help that they need. So again, I think Shannon will talk more about how a lot of families feel either like they shouldn't need to support their child so much, or why do I need to, or can I support them, will it hurt them in the long run? And my answer is typically like, kids with ADHD need a lot of repetition and a lot of practice in that point of performance. So that's why school-based supports are so important, because I can take a child, take them to my office, talk to them about how they should use self-control or they should organize, but as soon as they leave my office, they forget. That's part of the disorder as well, just like that forgetfulness, if it's out of sight, if it's out of mind. So if the teacher can provide that feedback or correction, and not in like a punitive way, but just as a way to provide a lot of practice for them, eventually it will become muscle memory and they'll be able to do it on their own. But for them to be really successful, they need a lot of practice and repetition. So again, just a really important thing to keep in mind. And then these are like examples of executive functioning. So when we talk about the term executive functioning, it's actually several, mini skills that comprise it. But definitely something that's important to kind of know what's appropriate for your child and when. So for example, like planning and organization, sometimes I have like 6-year-olds who parents are concerned about that. And I'm like, that's more of a skill that emerges around middle school. However, like the school should absolutely have the tools and knowledge of knowing like what to expect from a child and when. So that's, certainly where you can work with them to, again, find the right support so that they're able to show what they know, rather it be a reflection of their disability. Um, So this is just a quick slide about associated and secondary problems. So ADHD rarely travels alone. So things that are commonly seen with it are oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. So those are more behavioral-based disorders, anxiety and depression, substance use disorders, and then down here, school problems. So again, IQ tends to be average, so doesn't necessarily impact IQ in any way. But it may look like they're doing more poorly because of those executive functioning delays or deficits. However, a high rate of kids with ADHD do have learning disabilities, so it is important to kind of be able to suss out really what is an attention concern and what is, how their grades or performance is being impacted by attention versus like, can they actually just not do it? And no amount of motivation or supports that we provide are going to help them because they need differentiated instruction. So poor grades, school dropout, suspension, or expulsion. Another problem associated with ADHD is accidental injury. So we talked about, like driving, car accidents, traffic violations, especially as you get older, legal problems, job loss, and marital problems as well. The future is never written for a kid with ADHD. And obviously, I think because you're here wanting to know how to support your child, that's obviously a really great step forward to kind of mitigating or making sure some of these problems don't occur. So the last couple of things I'll talk about the diagnosis is these important defining features of ADHD. So this was based off an article in Attitude, and I really like, as I was reading it, it's like, yes, these are the 3 things that I would love parents to know about the diagnosis and how it shows up in your day-to-day life. So the first is an interest-based nervous system. So again, we're not thinking about ADHD as a like not being able to pay attention. We're thinking of it as their nervous system is always looking for things that are fun, exciting, new. So that hyperfocus or being in the zone of something is often created by interest, competition, novelty, or urgency. So when you see kids who can only get their book project done when they're under a time crunch or when it's due in like 2 hours, like that's because that urgency finally kicks them into gear. So it's not created by importance. So you can't say, you need to do this because your dad will be so disappointed, or then you're gonna lose your money, or you're not be able to drive. That might be really important to them, but if it's like too far in the future, or something like you don't want to get a bad grade, again, that's in however many months from now that consequence might happen. So it's less likely to kind of kick them into gear. So this also results in difficulty with transitions. So kids who are doing something that they like, or even if it's something they don't like, they just want to finish it. We often see kids with ADHD have difficulty transitioning from one activity to another, and that's called set shifting. So that's, getting ready in your mind to mentally do something else. So that's obviously something we can't physically see, but something that is very challenging. So experiencing rewards just kind of goes back with the interest-based nervous system. So a lot of, especially younger kids, will have behavior plans for school or be working toward a specific goal. And that is great. So that those are, there's a lot of research that show things like daily report cards are very helpful. And it's helpful to note that they are hard to implement. So one of the biggest kind of, I don't want to call it complaint, but just like difficulty is that kids with ADHD, their interests change so often. So something that they liked to, or they wanted to earn yesterday is now it's totally different, or they don't care anymore. So they, a way that you can kind of get around that is by keeping your rewards novel, keeping it interesting. But it's hard. It takes a lot of effort on your part as a parent to do that. But it is interesting to know that is brain-based. So again, they have less chemicals in their brain, physiologically, that kind of activate on these reward circuits in their brain. So, generally with ADHD, the highs are higher, the lows are lower, and we'll talk about that with emotional regulation, but same with like experiencing rewards. So rewards and punishments, or just consequences in general, need to be immediate and they need to be frequent. Otherwise, it's less likely to be effective. And as you can imagine, again, like working toward a good grade or something like that, which might work for other kids, is not going to be helpful if the grade is weeks and weeks in the future. Next is emotional dysregulation. So this is the other component of ADHD that is not reflected in the diagnostic criteria, but it should be, and I would think that it would be in the future as well. So talking about emotions, that's not something we can easily see and measure. So that's kind of thought as to why it's not currently in our diagnostic criteria. But this is arguably one of the most important aspects of ADHD. So regulating emotions, and then also, as we can see in the diagnostic criteria, regulating your movements, regulating your attention. Again, it all comes down to a disorder of regulation. So a lot of kids who have ADHD, again, they feel emotions very intensely. So that often does look like, getting very angry or getting very frustrated, but it can also mean getting very sad or getting very silly. But generally, they have instances where they kind of just go up, 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 up. And so parents might say that your child has horrible mood swings. Do they have bipolar disorder? Or, there's a really small problem and they have a huge reaction. What is wrong? Or having anger problems. So these are all things that are well within the scope of ADHD, but if you looked at the diagnostic criteria, it may not look that way. So again, what emotional impulsivity might look like: low frustration tolerance, quick temper, disproportionate emotional reactions, difficulty calming down, getting super excited, super silly, being very sensitive to disapproval or criticism, or just getting easily stressed very easily. So the last kind of big area here is rejection sensitivity. So there's another, I think, fairly well-known statistic here that kids with ADHD on average receive 20,000 more negative messages by age 10 than their peers. I used to work in schools as well, so I feel this in a big way in terms of, it's very hard to manage a large classroom of kids. So, to keep things moving, kids with ADHD typically do just get a lot of corrective feedback, and we would love to see that balanced with an even higher amount of praise or positive recognition. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So another example of this is from Dr. Sharon Saline, which is also another wonderful psychologist researcher in ADHD. So these are all people you can go look up. She says that there's 15 negative comments for every child, or for every ADHD child, there's only one positive comment. And again, for any kid, we would like to see that ratio be at least 4-to-1, so 4 positives to 1 negative. So 15-to-1, like that's, it's very impactful, and you can only imagine like how difficult and why kids with ADHD might start to have a negative self esteem or negative outlook on themselves. So this also can result in just, giving up tasks easier, like why even bother trying? I failed in the past, I might fail again. And it's worth noting too, a lot of kids with ADHD are aware of their differences from peers. So I'm certainly an advocate of, as soon as you get the diagnosis, talking to your child about it, because then they can start to advocate for themselves. And there's nothing wrong with having ADHD, but keeping it from them kind of may make them start to question, what's wrong with me? Because kids as young as 6 that I've seen for evaluations, they're aware that that something's different from them and their peers. So they may have lower self-esteem, and they can see this as, maybe I'm just lazy, maybe I don't have enough willpower. But again, that's not the case. And usually they're working all night to get something done, and it's just, it's very difficult to get it done. So constant worry that they're not enough, or placing little value on their opinions or ideas. This tweet here is, I think, or I guess now it's not Twitter, but anyway, this tweet here is a great example. So this is an ADHD like personality, I guess you would call it. But he says ADHD is constantly being told you're doing it wrong, even though your way also works. And I feel like this really resonates with a lot of the kids that I work with and the families I work with, because they might do some crazy thing to get their socks on, and it's not the fastest or most efficient, but at the end of the day, they do get them on. So, kind of thinking about with parents, is it worth the battle? Is it done? Then, sometimes we have to give up a little bit of that micromanaging if it does get done. It's a little bit of a difference in perspective. And I think another example here is like families who want to have a really nice organized home versus a practical home. And so with ADHD, that might look like having little piles everywhere, or whatever it does to make your family work is the best way. So social difficulties. So kids with ADHD can have some social challenges as well. And this again is related to those symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So we typically see that kids with ADHD are can be very social and don't have difficulty making friends, but they might have difficulty keeping friends. So, you would imagine if you had a friend who didn't take turns, always talked over you, or had difficulty understanding your point of view, getting stuck on what they want to talk about and not really, leaving space for the other person to talk, or just not picking up on subtle cues like, I'm over this, I don't want to talk about this anymore, because they're kind of inattentive or daydreaming within their conversations. Those are how it can kind of impact relationships, in addition to just emotional impulsivity of, big reactions. And then ADHD in girls. So this is another really fascinating and important area, I think. So a lot of the research that we have on ADHD that contributed to the diagnostic criteria was done on white English-speaking males. So we would say, kind of like our majority population. So what we know about ADHD is that it presents differently in girls. So there's certainly girls who are hyperactive and impulsive type as well, but most often they exhibit more of those inattentive or like sneaky symptoms. So I'm feeling like they're daydreaming a lot, feeling internally anxious or sad, shy or inattentive. However, interestingly, excessive talking is always on the list for girls, but it's perceived differently. So for girls, it's perceived as being chatty. If you had a boy who was talking a lot, that might be like, boys don't usually talk that much, like there must be something wrong. So trouble maintaining friendships. We see some like picking at cuticles or skin, which is often interpreted as anxiety, and it could be, but it's also kind of like a fidget, or it's a repetitive behavior that they're doing as well. And then perfectionism. So this is another reason why girls are often also identified later in life than boys. So boys are typically identified younger, girls maybe a little later. And that's because a lot of them internalize that perfectionist way of doing things. So they may get an A on a project or report, but what the teacher didn't see is that they were working all night the night before because they procrastinated or forgot about it. So at the end of the day, it looks the same, and that's certainly the problem with schools only relying on grades as a basis for like IEP or 504 accommodation supports, because the process to getting there is also very important. So just another note that just society tells girls to be people pleasers or do well in school, and be more socially conscious. So I do like this quote about friendships and females require more sophistication and maintenance. So I have a lot of boys that I see for evaluations who will get into, they'll be like, yeah, we fought over that. And then we said, do you want to play? Like they just get over it really easy. Whereas girls can, kind of hold a grudge, or something that's a slight dig might be something that lasts several days or longer, because it's just a different way of communicating and interacting with each other. Um, and then of note too, girls often also meet criteria for depression or anxiety disorders. So a lot of the times we see girls diagnosed with that first, and then ADHD as an afterthought. Whereas it's kind of the reverse true for boys who are more externalizing or more externally hyperactive or impulsive. So going back to that perfectionism piece, this means that a lot of females and some boys as well, but like I said, specifically for girls, they can get by on their intelligence and compensatory or coping strategies all the way through until middle or high school, or even beyond that as well. So this means symptoms may not appear until puberty, which is a time that is, automatically or naturally very difficult for a lot of kids. So that's talking about the importance of, working with the provider who is well versed in ADHD if you're questioning the diagnosis. But overall, ADHD in females is just more of that disorganized, inattentive kind of presentation. And I, again, categorize it as sneaky because it's less kind of slapping you in the face. So last kind of thought here is that ADHD is a disorder of performance. So again, we've talked about that piece or that phrase, point of performance. So children with ADHD often know what to do, but they have trouble doing it. So when you say to a child, you knew better than that, you're probably right. So, maybe that's not the most helpful feedback because you're right, they do know better than that. So we're missing the point. So the point is that their brain chemistry has made it so that they've impulsively done something or they've, missed something. So, giving just the opportunity to go back and try again and really, you should always have expectations and, I'll say consequences for your child, but just in general, knowing kind of what's in their control, what's out of their control is helpful. And it would certainly be helpful in conversations with the school as well. So last or almost last slide here, prognosis. So I think we've talked a bit about ADHD presentations. They change over time. So hyperactivity symptoms tend to fade as people get older and attention worsens. So what that means for you as your child or going into college is that, again, we would probably be thinking more of those accommodations for inattention. And then 2/3 of people who are diagnosed in childhood continue to have symptoms in adulthood. And this is predicted by severity of symptoms, comorbidities, and then parent mental health. So now this is the last slide. Just again reminding us ADHD, neither a disability, neither a superpower. There's positives and challenges to every type of symptom. And the best way to kind of go through it is develop a whole chest of coping strategies and then start to learn how to advocate when you need and for when you need something. All right.
Okay.
I think I stopped sharing.
Yeah,
Did I?
you did.
Okay.
I think yes. Okay, great. Hallie, that was amazing. And I feel like just at the tip of the iceberg of the resources available to families through the Cleveland Clinic ADHD program, but also the summer program itself, which my understanding of that summer program, part of the reason why my clients that have experienced it love it is it's not just sort of a summer program for the child, but also there's a lot of parent resources and programming as well. So, like a big part of supporting our children with ADHD is the parent, supports that are in place. And so anytime I have a client kiddo that is working with a therapist, I often ask the parents, like, what are the parents doing with the therapist? Because it's almost more important that the parents are aware of the strategies because we're the ones scaffolding those strategies at home. So I'll jump in with my part of the presentation. Give me one moment. And we're going to hope it goes well. Okay. Okay, so I'll pick up. Can you guys see the slides now? Hallie, can you just confirm to me that you guys can see this? Yes?
No.
Oh, okay. All right, let's try that again. Okay. Are we
No.
good?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pick up where Hallie left off. And before I move away from this slide, I just want to there's so many things that Hallie said that I wanted to jump in and highlight. But I decided to not be disruptive, which would be an ADHD trait of mine. So I'll just start by saying that this topic is near and dear to me because I have a kiddo with ADHD. And in the process of him being diagnosed with ADHD, discovered that I myself have ADHD combined type. So I feel like that is a story that many women are in our generation are sharing. And I share that story because I think that it's empowering and also helpful to other people to sort of demystify ADHD and talk about it openly, because I think this slide shows that there are, like many wonderful aspects to people that have ADHD that are attributable to our ADHD, right? And so where the challenges and negativities can resonate very loudly sometimes, I think it's helpful to recognize that the challenges that we experience related to ADHD are the trade-offs for the many wonderful benefits that we have. So I often talk about how I work with kiddos that have ADHD that are wonderfully creative and charismatic, and they can work a room and work a crowd. But yet they struggle with being on time and sustaining attention and these other things that society really requires us to utilize frequently. And so that can be very challenging to navigate because you're constantly being required to do these things that ADHD make challenging. But then there's this whole world of you that is wonderful, that's not always in society's forefront, right? Like being on time and getting up in the morning is something we have to do every single day. We don't always get to display our creativity, right? Or the other ways that we shine because of ADHD. So I think it's really compelling and empowering to talk about it. And it's something that I encourage families to do with their children in an age appropriate way, because ADHD is not going to go away for them. And so talking about it openly helps us then work on strategies to deal with the challenges and highlight the beautiful benefits of ADHD. So that's my little soapbox about ADHD. I love serving this community because I know them well, and I know them because I live them. The other thing I want to share about ADHD is the hereditary components. And so I think part of the challenge in raising a kiddo with ADHD is that one or both of the parents are also living with ADHD. So some of the challenges that you're trying to navigate with your kiddo, like getting out the door on time for school, are challenges you yourself have. And you can sort of feed off of each other or exasperate. So again, going back to sort of acknowledging and awareness helps us navigate those hurdles. All right. So I wanted to start, sort of start at the beginning, which is early intervention. Our little kiddos that, are just starting to show these developmental milestones that may start to uncover some potential ADHD. So I just like to throw this slide in here to make sure everyone's always aware of the value of the early intervention services that are available through our county and state funding. So these are for our kids that are age 0 to 3. You can reach out to the county early intervention services program, and they can come in and do assessments and help identify if your kiddo has needs that need addressing through the early intervention program. The beautiful thing about this program is through assessments, if your kiddo qualifies, they will develop. You'll see here on the left-hand side the process. So after they determine eligibility, they will develop an individualized family service plan. And that's where you can begin working with professionals on strategies and implementing those strategies early and often, right? So the importance of early intervention and the effectiveness of early intervention is, I think, very clear and talked about often, but actually getting the early intervention in place, the early intervention program through the county is a great resource for that. The other reason why it's wonderful is as your kid gets close to aging out at age 3, they will, if you're already aligned with an individualized family service plan, streamline you right into the assessment process for an IEP, which could lead to additional services. So that helps there not be a gap in services. I'll just share, my personal story because I think this is helpful. You're not going to know that a kiddo has ADHD in the 0 to 3 range, right? Like that's something that typically gets diagnosed later in life. My kiddo was a heavy sensory seeker. He was a runner, jumper, crasher, always seeking sensory input. And luckily for me, I work in this field. And so I would talk to clients with 6 and 7-year-olds that would describe how that child acted as a 3-year-old. And I recognized them because that child was living in my house. So I was able to reach out to early intervention services and get them engaged. And slowly we began to understand that those sensory seeking behaviors were part of a larger story for him. As he got older, we're able to identify that he has ADHD. So I love early intervention services, and I always have to put a plug in for them. Okay. So when we're talking about supporting a student with ADHD in the school setting, there are different mechanisms for doing that. And I want to dive into that. So there's, two terms that probably many people have already heard: Individualized Education Program, or IEP, and Section 504 plans. And this slide just goes over some of the differences between the two. First, they're governed by different laws, which many things about the IEP and 504 process are similar, but they do have some key differences, and those differences typically relate back to the fact that they're governed by different laws. So IEPs are governed by the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and services through IDEA are available from kindergarten through 12th grade, or age 22 for those students that we determine need additional support until the age 22. So IDEA has that specific time frame, whereas the Section 504 is derived from the Rehabilitation Act, and those supports and services are lifelong. So that's important to know, because as your kid ages out, if they're on an IEP and they age out at 22 or upon graduation, they can shift those supports to Section 504. And that's where the law provides supports for individuals with disabilities in higher education and work. The eligibility criteria is different for both of them, and we will talk about that as well. I think the key difference in terms of what is included is you can include accommodations in both an IEP or a 504, and even related services. The difference is when you have an IEP, you are modifying curriculum, you are providing specially designed instruction to help that student with their disability. And that's where the difference in the two programs really lies. And also helps explain part of the eligibility process. I think an important thing to note in this slide is oftentimes we think of 504 plans as inferior to IEPs. And if our kiddo was not identified for an IEP, they're getting something, inferior in a 504 plan. I like to think of this as finding the right fit. And for some kids, a 504 plan is the right fit. And for other kids, they truly show a more elevated need related to their disability that results in an IEP. And so this is just about finding the right fit for your individualized student, right? Because every student is different and comes with a different set of needs. Okay, so 504 eligibility. 504s, a student is eligible for a 504 if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. We'll see in a minute the IEP requirements are narrower than this requirement. This is pretty broad. A major life activity can include a lot of things like self-care, or learning is considered a major life activity, right? And then, so you'll see here, it says caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. And that impairment is resulting in a need at school. It's impacting them at school such that they need some support to remediate the impacts of that impairment. A lot of times we'll find kiddos with ADHD end up in a 504 plan because they're probably pretty high functioning. and they're getting good grades. Maybe they are smart, and they found some ways to deal with their ADHD symptoms. So we're not showing like a big academic impact, but we are seeing other impacts in terms of time management, sustaining a task. Maybe they need a quiet space to take tests. So we are going to accommodate them through that 504. IEP eligibility is a little narrower than a 504. So here I'm showing the actual like IEP eligibility worksheet that we use when we are going through the IEP process. And the key to this worksheet are these questions right here. So the eligibility determination is going to ask, does the student have a disability? And does that disability impact them such that they need specially designed instruction in the school setting? When we are talking about whether that student has a disability, we are referring to this list here on the right of disability categories. So anything from specific learning disabilities in reading or math, for example, autism spectrum disorder, speech and language disorder. One that is not on here is developmental delay, which is a specific category for children up to age 10. So a lot of times those preschoolers or kindergartners are categorized under developmental delay because they're pretty young and we don't have like a clear label yet. We're still sort of figuring out exactly what's going on with this kiddo. So developmental delay is there as a catch-all. So first we have to identify one of these categories that fits this student, and then whether that you'll see here, the child demonstrates an educational need that requires specially designed instruction. Oftentimes, we see ADHD falling under the category of other health impairment. Okay, and then here's the evaluation process. So I'm going to walk you through this as quickly as I can. So if you suspect that your kiddo may need an IEP, you would go to the school and you would make a request to evaluate your student for an IEP. I always recommend that that request be in writing, of course, because I'm a lawyer and we always want everything in writing. But also, there are really important deadlines related to the IEP process. And so delivering that in writing provides a very clear timestamp on when you made your request. So it's as simple as an email to the teacher, to the principal, copying maybe the teacher and the school counselor that says, I think that my kiddo would benefit from an IEP, and I'm requesting that the team consider him for IEP assessments, him or her for IEP assessments. And you can give like a couple of reasons why, but really you can dive into the reasons in the following meeting. So you make the request within 30 days, the school district must either agree to evaluate or refuse to evaluate your child. This meaning that within 30 days, they have to provide a formal response to your request. From the time of your request to that 30-day mark, they will have a meeting that is sometimes called a quote unquote suspicion meeting. Essentially, it's a meeting to determine whether the team suspects your student has a disability that impacts them at school. So there's a couple important parts of that. The team is the school and you. Parents are always part of the team. And two, do they suspect that your student has a disability that's impacting them in the school setting? So this is not, do they have a disability, is do we suspect? So we don't need definitive statements here, and you don't need a medical diagnosis to initiate this process. But if your kid is showing difficulties in the academic setting that could relate to a disability, that's what we're talking about. How is that kiddo's disability manifesting in the school environment? So if you have a kiddo that is often that is struggling with initiating a school assignment, struggles with completing school assignments. When they're in the classroom and they're doing classwork, does that student struggle with starting that classwork and completing that classwork? Are they moving around, doing other things, getting distracted, trying to talk to their peers? is this a constant cycle that's happening with your kiddo in the school setting, such that the team can say, hey, there may be a disability at play. We suspect there's a disability impacting them in the school setting. So by within 30 days, you need to have that meeting and make a determination about whether or not we suspect a disability that impacts the kiddo in the school setting. If the team does suspect a disability, then you will begin the assessment process, which starts with a planning meeting to determine what assessments the school team will be completing to determine whether the student has a disability. So those assessments typically include a psychological assessment and an educational assessment. And then can also include things like an occupational therapy assessment, physical therapy, speech and language, depending on what needs that kiddo is showing in school, or what potential impairments they're showing at school. One of the things I like to point out here is talking about an OT evaluation. Oftentimes we think about OT in terms of like manual tasks like writing, but OT also includes sensory. So if you have a kiddo with sensory sensitivities, a kiddo that sensory seeks or sensory avoids, then you would want to ask at this stage for an occupational therapy assessment as well. The district has 60 days from the planning meeting to complete those assessments. Then you'll get what's called an evaluation team report, which is a big stack of assessments. And you'll have an evaluation team report meeting. And at that meeting, you're going to go through all of the assessments with everyone on the team, and make a determination about whether or not the student is eligible for an IEP. So at that point, the team will either say, yes, they are eligible for an IEP, or no, they don't meet the criteria. Oftentimes for kiddos with ADHD, when they say no, we transition to talking about a 504. And I will say one of the things I really like about reaching a 504 through that process is that you have the benefit of these really rich assessments to help inform the 504 and what your student, what sort of support your student will be receiving. If you disagree with the school team and their assessments, you're able to seek something called an independent educational evaluation. And that's where the district pays for an independent third party to provide a set of assessments that the team can then come back together and review, and take another look at eligibility based on those assessments. Once eligibility is determined, the district has 30 days to create and implement an IEP. So that's a whole lot. I can spend an entire presentation talking about the IEP process. What I want you guys to know about this process is it's not always an IEP for a kiddo with ADHD, and that sometimes it's hard to convey the kiddo's struggles in this process, particularly for our kids that internalize. So our kiddos that are externalizing their ADHD symptoms, they're very visible, right? They're probably having some behaviors. They're probably talking out of turn, somewhat disruptive, often distracted, moving around, which can lead to some discipline problems, if not just like in classroom behaviors. Those kiddos are getting noticed. Our kiddos that are internalizing, particularly girls, as Hallie mentioned, they are often concerned with people pleasing. And so there's this extra pressure for them to internalize their symptoms, keep it together, and then they get home and they fall apart. And so you get that little puddle of a kiddo that has held in their ADHD symptoms all day long, and then they walk in your front door in their safe place with their safe people that love them no matter what, and they fall apart. And that's a kiddo that might need 504 supports to help remediate some of those symptoms so they're not so focused on holding it together all day and then falling apart in your arms when they get home. I also worry a lot about those internalizers because, as Hallie talked about, ADHD is often accompanied by anxiety and depression. And I think that internalization and just trying to hold it together all day, it puts a lot of pressure on a kid. And that's a lot for any person to handle, let alone a child. And I think we start to see those anxiety symptoms percolating, and in middle school and high school, potentially progressing to depression. So again, I feel like this community is near and dear to me because I can relate to a lot of these things. Um, so let's talk about accommodations. Accommodations, as I said, are the things that you can receive in an IEP or a 504. And I can't emphasize enough that for some kiddos, a 504 is going to be the plan that's implemented in your school because they're not showing like academic deficiencies that rise to the level of an IEP, or they're not showing social emotional challenges that are rising to the level of an IEP. So accommodations are a great common ground between an IEP and 504. Uh, things that you can receive whether you're on either of the two. So I like to think of the accommodations in terms of what are we trying to support? Are we trying to support a student that's struggling significantly with focus and attention, impulsivity, restlessness or the need for movement, initiating and sustaining a task, reading and writing composition, which I'll tell you why I included that in this list in a minute, organization, time management, behavior, self-esteem, or peer interactions. And, emotional dysregulation was not listed here, but definitely goes in with this, particularly when it's dovetailed with impulsivity, because emotional regulation and impulsivity often lead to behavior and discipline moments. So I like to think about what is it we're trying to support and then couple that with accommodations. One of the reasons, the reason why I list reading and writing composition here, and this is not clinical, Hallie can jump in and tell me if there's anything clinical to support this, but I often find that kiddos with ADHD really struggle with writing and reading. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First, when you're reading, particularly when you move into books that don't have a lot of pictures, that is a lot of text in one place. And I think it's hard for kiddos to focus through that text. And even if they're reading it, they're not really retaining it. So that person that's like, oh, I just read a whole paragraph and I have no idea what it just said. So I think the page can seem very cluttered and chaotic and sort of scrambles their brain and makes it difficult to get through a reading task. And what I mean by getting through a reading task is get through a reading task with comprehension, with the ability to show at the end of that reading task that they understood what they read. And then I think similar issues arise with writing tasks as well. So if a teacher gives you a project and says, okay, here's your writing prompt, go forth and compose, that can be really unstructured for a kiddo with ADHD. And then you already struggle with initiating a task. And so now you're initiating this unstructured task. And you may know exactly what you want to say. And if you asked me to verbalize it, I could tell you all about what some event or book report, but I can't get it on paper to save my life. And I tend to see those are things that our kiddos with ADHD struggle and we're trying to support in the education setting. On the flip side, I can see those same kiddos really thrive in math. And again, Hallie, I don't know if there's anything clinical to support this, but I like to think that it's because math tends to be really structured. And it's really like sort of pictorial, right? Like there's numbers, they line up, there's a line, I add them, and it's interactive, right? Like you're doing something and writing while you're doing it. So they can really thrive in math and then stumble with those reading math problems. So I like to point that out as like, what is it we're trying to help support? Because these can be moments where we need things like graphic organizers. A graphic organizer will structure an open-ended written assignment and will provide a way for that student to think about how to structure their thoughts. And that helps them bridge that gap from what's in my brain to what I'm trying to get on paper. So some different things we can do to accommodate these kiddos for focus and attention, preferential seating them at the front of the classroom, flexible seating. So this is, seating that might have some sort of movement or a band on a chair that's helping them get that movement out. And when you're getting that movement out, I think sometimes it's hard for us to visualize this because it's like, how does a wobble seat help my kid that likes to like run and needs a lot of exercise? But if you're getting that movement out, even in those little increments throughout the day, it's not building up, right? And we'll couple that flexible seating with things like breaks, movement breaks, not just a break, not a break to go sit somewhere and try to regulate. Some of our kiddos need to get up and move to regulate. So regulation doesn't always look like meditation, right? Or like a really calm, quiet strategy. We have to think about what this kiddo specifically needs. For focus and attention, also redirection, extra prompts and cues. So sometimes that teacher needs to come back and give that extra prompt to that student. Hey, did you get that task started? Did you need any help starting that task? How are you doing with your reading? How are you doing with your writing assignment? So prompts and cues, a visual schedule, right? We've talked about time management and structure. A visual schedule is a nice way for a student to do like a quick glance at their schedule and what they're doing next. Movement breaks I touched on. I think these can be really helpful and even implement at home. For example, my my sweet 6-year-old who um, will does piano lessons every day. So my 6-year-old with ADHD that I do like a 15-minute piano lesson. I will oftentimes give him a good movement break right before he goes into a lesson. So like, let's set that expectation. What can he actually do? If I try to take him from something seated right into piano, it's going to crash and burn every time. Breaks between tasks. Chunking is let me talk about chunking for a minute. So chunking is where a teacher takes a big assignment and breaks it into pieces and helps that student navigate that big assignment through chunking. And you'll see at the bottom of this slide, I say teach strategies, fade supports, create independence, because part of what I'm doing as an attorney advocate in the education setting is I'm advocating for all of these accommodations and services to help support your kiddo in school. But as they get older, they need to learn those strategies. And we need to see the adults fading the supports so that they can implement those strategies on their own. We need to understand that we're building them towards adulthood where people aren't going to be there to chunk assignments for them. So at some point, I want to see that kiddo start to do their own chunking. So graphic organizers I touched on, extra time to complete assignments, extended time for tests, testing in small group, distraction-free environments, teaching note-taking strategies, which is really helpful for the segue to college. Planners and organizers, I'm running out of time, but I want to give a quick plug here because I think planners and organizers are really interesting. And oftentimes we make them available to the whole classroom. And so we'll say, oh, that's not an accommodation because it's available to the whole classroom. It's an important distinction. If something's available to the whole classroom, it's not a formal accommodation. And so it doesn't have to go on a 504 or an IEP. But the difference for a kiddo with ADHD is they need support actually implementing and using that planner effectively. You can put a planner in front of them and it can go to the wayside very quickly. So we need someone to provide that extra support in implementing it and helping them make it habit and make it work for them. I also think, and I'm sure Hallie knows more about this than me, but that people with ADHD need a different approach to a planner. And I find that I'm classically that person that starts January 1st with a brand new shiny fancy planner that I got from Target. And by February 1st, it's out the door. So I find that my strategies in terms of planners is more fluid than that. And oftentimes it's a blank sheet of paper or a notebook full of blank sheets of paper where I can start each day with my to-do list and I can scribble and I can do lots of things and it's not as structured. So I think planners are really important to help our kiddos actually use the planner. Fidgets, allowing students to run errands. This is a really interesting approach. So instead of just giving them a movement break, give them something purposeful that helps them feel like they're doing something helpful. This helps us with self-esteem too. Like, let's think about that kiddo's self-esteem while we're serving them. Positive reinforcement and ignoring minor behaviors, which is also a potential parenting strategy that can sometimes be difficult to implement. So this is just a sampling of accommodations. There's all kinds of accommodations out there. They're often written in different ways, but mean the same thing. It's really about knowing the kiddo through assessments and what they personally need for their individualized is key, education plan or their 504. Okay, so I talked a lot about that. And I want to talk about college for a quick second. So let's start with why college is particularly challenging. So when we transition to college, we are doing a lot of things during that transition. That student is going to suddenly have more responsibilities and independence, less adult supervision and scaffolding. So we just kind of inverse their life. They go from a life where they're living with their parents. They know they have to be at school from 8 to 4. They might be shifting and changing and moving classrooms from 8 to 4, but they know Monday through Friday, I got to go somewhere from 8 to 4. There are lots of adults involved in that process. There's probably an adult who makes sure that they get up in the morning, and adults throughout the day that are making sure they're going to where they need to be. We get to college and that all falls out. So all that structure goes away. All those externalized structures go away, and you can be a college student who goes to a class 2 days a week in the afternoon, and then on other days you're going to class in the morning, and your schedule is shifting, and it's a lot less structured, and there's a lot less adults around sort of shepherding you through that structure. Increased distractions, all kinds of distractions in many different ways, and new social situations. So these are some of the reasons why college is like a game changer, right? Like it really requires a lot more executive functioning, and it can be a big struggle for folks that are not ready for that transition. The other thing I often hear is that this is a moment where medication may be reintroduced. So if you had a kiddo who was medicating earlier in their student career and maybe got really comfortable and felt like they didn't need it in high school, this might be a moment where medication comes back into the conversation because all of these externalized structures go away. College considerations. So how can we support our kiddos in college? First, as I noted before, we are no longer dealing with IEPs because IDEA only exists until your student graduates. So now we're working within the realm of the 504 Rehabilitation Act. So what you want to do, what we often suggest is like an exit meeting with your IEP. And this is where you can sort of finalize those strategies that have been working for your student as a senior in high school. And it gives you a nice document that you can take to your college support staff and turn that into some sort of service plan in college that can help that student with their ADHD needs in college. Same thing with the 504. You can take that document and it's a nice segue to that conversation in college, in the college setting. Standardized tests, you want to think about getting them certain accommodations for standardized tests. And here's one of the reasons why having these documents in place in the K-12 setting is really helpful, because these documents create the paper trail that are going to allow you to apply for accommodations on standardized tests. And I have supported students that needed accommodations on higher education tests like the MCAT or the LSAT, and really having that paper trail is what they're looking for to know that you're making a genuine request for extended time. And so that this is where you're going to want to show that history of my student needed extended time in high school or in middle school. They always needed to be in a quiet setting. So getting those accommodations for standardized tests in high school for things like the ACT and the SAT, your high school can help you with seeking those accommodations when you apply for that testing. I think another thing, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but disclosing your condition in college applications, I think this is a little bit of a judgment call, but oftentimes if you feel like your performance was inhibited by your ADHD, it can be a nice way to explain like the whole picture of who you are as a student. And, you know, I was getting B's, but like truly that's not showing my true potential because this is something I've navigated my whole life. You want to, when you're looking for colleges, you'll want to ask about the programs and supports they have for students with ADHD. It's important to keep that in mind when you're selecting a school. And then before school starts, you want to contact their support services department and already get those supports in place. So when you arrive, you're ready. multimodal learning, study strategies, lectures, and note-taking strategies. So here we want to think about those strategies that are effective for this student, and carry them over to college. And I feel like part of college is learning how you learn. Like now you're an adult and you're sort of learning and understanding how you learn. Like what are your effective learning strategies? So let's bring our effective ADHD strategies on that journey, right? Like don't leave them behind and make sure you don't, where so much is changing, keep this consistent, right? So for example, this this is a great example because as I was transitioning from college to law school, laptops were becoming something that every student had. And I really thrived on handwritten note taking because for me, that was my multimodal learning strategy. The task of writing while hearing the material really helped me retain what I was learning. And then I transitioned to a laptop and I felt that go away. And I transitioned off of the laptop. For some reason, moving to that laptop was removing a reinforcing strategy for me. Um, I feel like I sound like such a cliche parent saying this, but sleep, exercise, calming outlet, and alcohol avoidance, right? But like all of these things can be particularly harmful for someone with ADHD. And one of the reason why I list exercise and calming outlet is sometimes exercise doesn't resonate with a person, but a calming outlet, like maybe you're someone who resonates with meditating or knitting. Knitting, I have students like in middle school that knit because it's a really great calming strategy that involves movement. So find a calming strategy. If it is an exercise, find something else. Staying connected to family, right? Because they might notice if things start to go amiss. Having a therapist, particularly if you're not local to where your family is. And then awareness is empowering. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but knowing your ADHD and knowing what it looks like and knowing how to manage it and not being ashamed of it is really empowering. And I think will help carry these kiddos into college and through their 20s. So the last thing, which I'm not going to go over this, but we do provide the slides afterwards, but I have this advocacy best practice. I always like to talk to families about this. But the number one thing I will say from this slide is be collaborative, be collaborative, be collaborative. As much as we can, we want to go into our school meetings, and I do this as an attorney that represents families. You're not going to typically see me going into a meeting looking like a courtroom TV lawyer. I don't pound tables. I don't yell. I'm not aggressive. I'm there to be part of a team. And when I leave these meetings and you don't need my services anymore, you have to live with that school team. So I like to leave relationships as good as they were, if not better. So being collaborative is a really important part. It doesn't mean that we can't have challenging conversations. It doesn't mean we can't disagree, but really maintaining a respectful demeanor and being collaborative is a really important part of participating in IEP and 504 meetings. It also, on the flip side, is if something leads to due process, is often a reason that schools will state for why the IEP wasn't more successful because they had a family that was not collaborative and cooperative. So being collaborative, I think, is a really important aspect of working with your school team and finding good solutions for your kiddo. Listen, and it's easier said than done. I empathize with all of you. I've cried in my own kid's IEP meeting. It's an emotional process. It's part of the reason why I always tell people to take a friend. If you're not at the point or can't hire an attorney or an advocate, take a friend, even if it's just a warm body. So there's strength in numbers, but it's also helpful for someone else to hear the same thing you've heard, in case you missed something or you interpret it a different way. So with that, we are at 7:59, so I snuck right in there. But I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to use the chat to ask questions, or you can unmute and ask questions. And those can be questions for me or Hallie. And I'm just going to check the chat to make sure there aren't any questions hanging out in chat. Okay. Hallie, do you have anything to add?
No, I feel like we were very much on the same page in terms of there are so many resources for like finding accommodations or supports, just endless lists out there. But it does boil down to like knowing your child best and kind of coming in with an idea of what you think would be beneficial. And sometimes families are like, well, I don't know, like I don't know what would be helpful in the school. But you do know what helps them at home. So you do know something, and like, being informed and coming with something to bring to the table is very helpful, and then being collaborative in that process as well, because you're correct in that they're your team for a while. So if you can keep that relationship positive, that's better in the long run.
And one of the things I want to touch on, and I talk to lots of parents about this, is the social impacts. And I'm so glad that you touched on that today, Hallie. I think there's many things related to ADHD that can impact social relationships. First, the logistics, like if you're someone who struggles with being on time to things, that can eventually become very annoying, particularly to your friends that are not neurodivergent. And then the other aspects that you touched on, sort of the emotional regulation and perspective taking, if you're someone who kind of interrupts a lot or often commands the conversation, that can have negative impacts. And then you wrap that into the self-esteem aspect of, all of the what you described about the negative comments is so enlightening. And so you have someone who may get a lot of negative feedback and then they're struggling in social situations, and it's hard not to have self-esteem troubles if that's the life you're living, right? So we do have a question: at what age do you recommend including a child in their 504 meetings? This is such a great question. I think it really depends on the child, right? And it feels like a cop-out answer, but it's true. Some of my students are more mature earlier in life and ready to handle those 504 meetings. And the law does have some specific requirements around when a kiddo with an IEP has to be involved in their meetings. So I think, oh gosh, why is it escaping me? I usually know this. Around like 14 or 16, we're going to start involving them in some capacity. I would say about middle school, right? Like, and again, gauge their maturity level, but beginning to involve them in the process. I think one of the things I start to see in middle school is that students are embarrassed about the accommodations they're receiving. So I think one strategy for combating that is involving them in the meetings, so that they understand that why these strategies are being provided and the importance of the strategies. And hopefully that can help counterbalance any embarrassment. The other thing that I think is helpful to know about including your child in a 504 or IEP meeting is they do not need to stay for the whole meeting. So we can tell the team in advance, the student would like to attend, they're coming for this reason. Can we cover these things first and let them go back to class? That way you can bifurcate the meeting. There are oftentimes things that just the adults in the room need to discuss. But having your kiddo come to the meeting, see the visual of this entire team that's there to support them and understand their accommodations better can be very informative and empowering. Hallie, I don't know if you have a answer to that question as well.
No, that was again same wavelengths in terms of I work with a lot of kids who have the supports but then elect not to use them when it comes to the time where they should actually be using them. And so a lot of that is because of well-meaning families, kind of are trying to pile on the supports but not including the child. So you can imagine that if they were involved in that process, they might take more ownership of it and feel better using the supports. And it kind of comes down to like knowing yourself, knowing I have ADHD, and just really understanding why these things are happening too. So the more open you can just be about everything, even when they don't want to hear it, just always having the opportunity to talk about it when they're ready, is helpful.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes there'll be like 10 adults in a room for 3 hours talking about a student's IEP. And then somehow we all forgot to ask the student, right? We all get so focused on the task at hand that we'll forget to ask the student. And particularly with like social emotional needs, like what is the student interested? Like if you're going to build a positive behavior support system, you need to get some feedback from that student on their interests and their likes. A nice antidote for this is my 6-year-old will often complain about washing his hands and he'll prefer hand sanitizer. And so finally one day I was like, what is the problem with this? Like, how many times had I battled him about washing his hands and didn't stop and ask him why this matters to him? And so I said, hey, kiddo, what's the problem with washing our hands? And he said, it's boring. It takes too long. And so for his little ADHD brain, that 20 seconds was like excruciating, right? And the hand sanitizer was like, shh, and he's off to the races. So asking our kiddos, it's so important. That's such a great point, Hallie. Okay, I don't think we have any questions. Um, Nobody coming off mute. So I think that wraps it up for tonight. But I really appreciate everyone being here. I think this was an amazing session. Hallie, thank you for your wealth of knowledge. And thank you for everything you do at the Cleveland Clinic. Parents and families, thank you for joining us. We do post these later. So if you know someone that could benefit, feel free to send them to our website, and we will have these available for viewing for those who missed out. Have a great evening.